Hello and good morning or good afternoon wherever you are in the world. Warm greetings from Rwanda. You are tuning in for the International Congress for Conservation Biology's Gender Mainstreaming or Gender Inclusivity Training. The title of this talk is Gender Inclusivity in Conservation Research, but my hope is that what I say actually translates to all sorts of research that's conducive to environmental outcomes. We are so pleased in Kigali to be hosting ICCB this year in 2021. My name is Dr. Lane Munir, and I am a Senior Research Fellow at the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management at the University of Rwanda. And my goal for today is that we talk a little bit about how we conceive of gender in conservation research. That would be a minority of what we talk about, maybe 20%. And then after that, I'd like to help integrate those definitions into our conservation research and analysis to have more gender inclusive outcomes and hopefully brainstorm some really concrete methods that anyone joining us can integrate into their own research models. So thank you for joining us. So let me give some grounding to help us understand how we got here today, right? Because I think for a lot of folks who are trained in traditional conservation sciences, gender is just not a topic of discussion in our training, right? So let me give some grounding and then we can help integrate that moving forward. So I would say at least 20 years ago, there was some self-reflection in the sciences, and we started talking about why is it that scientists talk about people as their research subjects. And there was this traditional model, this idea, and it's a misnomer, that scientists would go into a community, extract data from the people who live in that community, and produce these relatively unbiased outcomes that are rigorous and reliable and valid. There was a movement to, let's call it, equalize or make more horizontal this research model, with the idea that we are not going in and extracting data from people. The people who are part of the communities we study are really our conversation partners. And research should be discursive. And let's think about gathering data as us having a collaborative conversation in partnership with community members rather than us just taking from them. So now for folks doing inclusive research and specifically applied inclusive research, we don't talk about our research subjects, we talk about our research participants. And this shift came on some philosophical debate about who gets to interpret the social and biological science of others, right? So I would like to think at least that in anthropology or studies of, international relations, we've long been thinking about the lenses on which we view others, specifically if you're a scholar from the global north doing research on the global south, right? That calls for some inquiry into your position relative to the people that you're working with. And then the second question was about what disciplines get to do this interpretation. So historically, we think of anthropologists as the people studiers who can come up with these interpretations. But that's just not realistic. I mean, even a biologist doing research in a lab has some element of a social dynamic to how they do their work, right? So now most of us, we see the social elements to all of what's considered hard sciences historically, and we're trying to better account for those social dynamics. So the term that I'm going to use today is inclusive research, which we consider a better way to empower communities while still ensuring that science is as accurate as possible. So for anyone who might have this idea that including social dynamics in conservation research, could compromise the validity of scientific outcomes. On the contrary, I would say that not taking into account power dynamics in communities and inequalities in communities and the social construction of identity in communities, it really makes our data less valid, and taking those into account makes it more valid. So we're at a point in which inclusive methods in conservation research, by most people who have used them, are found to be very conducive to interdisciplinarity. So when you kind of expand your research models and specifically expand your methods, it really is helpful to speaking to scholars and researchers and those who implement programming across disciplines, right? It becomes more flexible, becomes more universal, becomes better. Your research can be a better portable model when you do inclusive methods. And I would say that COVID, we have found over the last almost 2 years, is exacerbating these gender-based inequalities. And maybe that shows in socially oriented research. So to paint broad brushstrokes, COVID research is showing us that the pandemic is increasing the income gap between men and women, because women were already the most vulnerable workers to begin with, particularly in the informal economy. We know that COVID is exacerbating the educational attainment gap between boys and girls, that girls are more likely to not go back to school if there's some sort of a lockdown that impedes their access to education. And we also know that COVID places an extra burden of caretaking responsibilities on women that it doesn't necessarily on men. So directly and indirectly in this post-pandemic world we live in, these inequalities in the communities that we study are just more salient than ever. So this is very timely, this idea of inclusive research methods. So for those folks who don't have a strong background in gender mainstreaming, so I would say even 10 years ago, you would hear the term gender equality almost all the time. And I hadn't quite heard the term gender equity. But now in my work as a researcher and academic and as a consultant, gender equity is the term that I find myself drawing on more. And there's a really important difference between the two. So I love this visual aid. It's a classic in gender trainings. And in the communities you work with, you might be able to see a difference of this. So the best way I describe this to my graduate students is that equality is really about sameness of opportunity. So when we think of equality, it's about the laws being equal for men and women, employment contracts saying men and women get paid the same thing, researchers who are going to collect data talk to men and women equally according to their research protocol. So that's about opportunity. But equity should really be our goal as researchers, because equity is about the sameness of outcomes. So we'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. But to reach actual sameness of outcomes in our research, simply planning for gender neutrality or gender sensitivity is not enough. We as researchers might have to take an extra step to make sure that our data actually reflects the voices and the inputs of all vulnerable populations. I mean, not just women, children, people with physical disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, people who are from marginalized or minority groups, either religiously or ethnically. So we might have to work a little bit harder to ensure that their voices are taken into account beyond just the planning in our research protocols. So the main concepts when we talk about inclusivity, the first is about gender roles. So most of us on here, I mean, we already know that sex is about your biology and gender is the social construction of your identity. And gender roles are really about the tasks and responsibilities assigned on account on sexual identity and cultural definitions of masculine and feminine. And this is really important to conservation research because when men and women have such strikingly different relationships with the environment. Men and women interact with conservation sites at different rates. They use natural resources at different rates and in different ways for different means. The best research on the gender differences in land use and conservation that I found really great outcomes in India and they travel really well in the African context. Wherever you might do your research, maybe think about the differences between how men and women use land and the environment based on gender roles, on how we say men and women should earn their money and behave. So access is really, really vital. And that's about the availability of resources, services, facilities, and knowledge and skills that can be used meaningfully. And this is really important in conservation research. An example of that would be land ownership. So there's many instances in which women's names might be on a land title or might be on an environmental asset. But having your name on a piece of paper is not the same thing as exerting meaningful decision-making capacity over how that resource is used. So that's where access comes into play. Can they actually access decision-making and power and use the resource as they wish? That's really what our analysis should be about. Control, obviously related to access, is about capacity to influence decisions and actions of other people. So in inclusive research, you might say that one of your participants has control over another participant, or one community has control over another community, if the first one can influence the behaviors of the second one, or even mandate the behaviors of the second one. And as I mentioned before, equality is about having equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities that do not depend on whether you're born male or female, and the needs of everyone in a community is considered. And equity recognizes that women and gender diverse people are not always in the same starting position as men because of historical and social disadvantages. And treating everyone, okay, this is how. If all of our respondents or all of our colleagues from other universities, or even, our own colleagues, if there is a difference in power among them and we treat them all equally, then actually the way we're treating them is reinforcing that power. So then in wherever our workplaces are, our universities, our NGOs, our think tank, our research institute, to make sure we have equal outcomes, we might need to make accommodations for people who have less power or privilege than others. So now moving in, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Here are like the basics of gender analysis and gender analysis theory. So in all of the literature on gender analysis theory about how we implement, mainstreaming in our research, we have come to the conclusion that the power structure is so long-standing and so pervasive, it's so deeply rooted, that many of us see it as normal and natural, and we don't even question power inequities when we see them because they feel organic. In actuality, these power imbalances are systemic and shape the institutions and systems in which we participate. Even if people as individuals support equality. So sometimes being an individual supporting equality is no match for these power structures. So we have to work a little bit harder and collaborate to decompress those power structures. Most people acknowledge that gender does change over time in all of the communities that we work. Most important to conservation biology and all conservation sciences is that the gender division of labor is the starting point for these imbalances. And these different spaces determine the lived realities that limit women's choices and opportunities. So the best way we can think of that is most people on this call know that in the communities where we work, women spend more time farming than men, and women spend more time in unpaid domestic work in the home than men. And in the communities where we work, men are more likely to sell the crops that women grew, right? And so that's a gender division of labor, and that's really where imbalances lie. So if men in the communities where we work tend to sell the crops more, they're holding on to the cash, they're mobile, they have more financial control than, say, a wife who's doing the actual growing and doesn't have first access to that cash, right? So that's an example in conservation biology of this gender difference of labor. Next, resource control is gender imbalanced Everywhere in the world, there is, last I read, there's no country on the planet that we have studied in which women do not spend more hours per week doing unpaid care work than men. So this is universal. Some countries it differs more than others, but this issue of time poverty that I just mentioned plays a key role in how communities approach their conservation strategies. So ultimately, de jure equality doesn't equate to de facto equality or equity, right? So equality on the books does not actually manifest itself all the time as equity in action, is what that means. So why are we talking about this? Why does it matter? And we are at a point in which gender analysis is an essential component, not a replacement or an addition to an overall analytical process that a successful program of social change requires. So in other words, gender analysis is not a paragraph we throw into results. So what this means is, I would say even a few decades ago, especially with the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, there was this idea that you shouldn't do research on environmental outcomes without mentioning women. And so oftentimes you would read a report or a policy brief or an article, and there would be a paragraph about women's outcomes at the end. And then we transitioned away from that and agreed on we really need to integrate or mainstream women more. And then we moved into, no, that's not enough. Women must be our unit of analysis. Women must be part and parcel of our entire research design, beginning to end, including with analysis. So if we do not fully understand the trends and dynamics that define and perpetuate gender inequality, we will be unable to mount a successful strategy to include gender dynamics into conservation research or any social science at all. So here are the terms, like when I think about the chronology of gender mainstreaming in research, I think first about the term gender neutral, which was the initial term, which is a terrible term. And all that really means is we're coming up with research designs that we don't want to actively harm women. That's what gender neutral means, is we're not going to privilege men in our research designs. And then that was replaced over the years with the term gender sensitive. And then you had many researchers saying their conservation research was gender sensitive research. And it's relatively better. And that basically means women are not getting a paragraph at the end. Maybe they're getting a page at the end. And then we move forward and we said, okay, we have to gender mainstream, and thinking about gender and inequality and vulnerability needs to be a part of our entire methodology. And that was certainly better, and that put women more at the fore. But now in 2021, we're really at a place where we use the term gender transformative. And that's the idea that not only do we account for women at every step of research, but that our research outcomes will be invested back into the community in a way that empowers women. So we share with women our research outcomes to help them be better, and that our research outcomes help contribute to more inclusive and equitable policy and NGO programming, and that women lead better lives. All vulnerable populations lead better lives because of our work. So we're at a point in which I really like the term gender transformative research. So if I can give you one, substantive framework that's a classic in development studies and conservation studies, it's aged really well, it travels really well, and if someone is going to adopt an inclusive framework, the Mosier framework is a really reliable, solid place to start. So the Mosier framework is a tool for gender analysis in development planning, but it translates really well into academic researches. Also, I actually use it both in consulting and my academic research. And it was developed by Caroline Mosier, and the goal of it is to free women and all vulnerable people from subordination and allow them to achieve equality, equity, and empowerment. She developed the framework for gender and development, GAD approach, which is also a classic if you want to look it up. In the 1980s while working at the University of London, and she expanded it into an entire methodology that is used around the world today in this book, A Theory and Method of Gender Planning. And this framework is based on her concepts of gender roles and gender needs. So roles and needs are really the meat of this. And it includes her views on the way that policy should approach gender and development planning. But as I said, it is wonderful just for scientific research on its own. So the three core components of it are about access to, use, and actual control of resources. And it asks, if you adopt the Mosier framework, which you can explore more, it interrogates the dependence of women and men on various natural resources differently, right? So most of us already know that women in the developing world who don't have running water spend many hours per week carrying water, and that water is considered woman's work and it's her job to provide water for the family, right? And that's very different than buying and selling land, which would be considered like a man's role. So that's examples. And you can think in whatever communities you work in, you can think about if there are groups of men and women that are more disadvantaged than others in terms of benefiting from, say, climate resiliency or whatever it is you work on in conservation. How do they benefit from conservation differently? And what can be done to improve their lives in terms of conservation? The next component of the Mosier framework has to do with the division of labor, which again is also related to resource control, right? And so you can think in whatever community you work in, what are the main activities of men and women, and which of those activities are paid or not? And then you can look at home-based and income-generating activities in particular, and which activities require maximum time and effort. Is there any seasonal pattern in their workloads? And in what ways has climate change or any COVID impacted the workloads for men and women, and what can be done? So an example of this is my research is on the mining sector in Rwanda. And women and men both work in mining. Men tend to work formally, women work informally. Men tend to do the jobs that require the greatest physical strength, whereas women tend to do the jobs that require longer hours of endurance. And women are more likely to do mining seasonally because they're still concerned with their farmland and their crops and their harvest, whereas men are more likely to do mining year round. So that would be an example of the gender division of labor as it impacts the environment and conservation efforts in the mining communities I study in Rwanda. And the third component of the Mosier framework has to do with participation and decision making. To what extent have men and women differentiated their decisions related to land use, and what are the differences in decision making over their tasks, and what are the challenges in the way that men and women or other vulnerable populations participate in decision making. It can be decision making as an individual, it can be decision making in the home, it can be decision-making in the larger community, or it can even be decision-making at the national level, or maybe even an international policy. So these are multi-tiered levels that we can think about the differences in participation and decision-making. Oops, sorry, thank you for your patience. So, conservation research, if you want to adopt a gender mainstream approach, should account for, at a minimum, resources, labor, and relationships. So as an example, if I'm designing a research methodology in conservation or doing a gender auditing of a research method in conservation or editing a report, in my head, I skim through and I say, okay, how does this publication in any way look at resources? Got it. How does this publication look at labor? Got it. How does this publication look at relationships, either within the home or the community or at the national level? And I try to make sure that these three elements in a gender mainstreamed output are more or less equal, so that resources, labor, and relationships all have equal attention in whatever it is that I'm looking at. So resources are about the gender-based differentials in access to and control. I'm sure you can think of an example of this where you work. Labor is about the imbalance in the sexual division of labor, and relationships are about the diversity of household structures and infra-household relationships. In conservation work, we do know that the way that a single-headed household, for example, with a single mother, especially living below the poverty line, the way that she interacts with the environment is very different